and short. It was noted the other day. Do you have George, do you have the remote?
Well, I have a fix for you, Karen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I've been asked to talk about Georgetown and Francis Marion. As the first speaker, it's always tough. You don't know if people have had their coffee yet. If I drone or if I can't hear me, put your hand up, I'll speak a little louder. Georgetown is the third oldest town in South Carolina. If my eyes are correct, it's in this area here. Charlestown is down here, and the other is Beaufort, if that's the right way to say it, which is down there. It was founded, or actually around 1732, when the planters in that area asked the Crown for the permission to have a customs port of entry because they wanted to be able to get their goods to market without having to go through Charleston. It was settled basically between then and 1735. During the American Revolution, the British, of course, came in 1780. They invaded South Carolina. They took Charlestown in May of 1780, and then they moved north, and they took Georgetown in July of 1780. It stayed in their hands until it was liberated by Francis Marion in May of 1781. That's what I have to say about Georgetown. The second part of this is about Francis Marion. And for those of you who don't know, Francis Marion was a general during the American Revolution from South Carolina. At the time South Carolina was invaded, he was a lieutenant colonel in the Continental Army. He was not in Charlestown because he broke his ankle and was sent out of the city before the city fell. He organized the resistance after the city fell, and for time being he was the only American force operating in South Carolina. When General Greene entered the state with a new American army, he cooperated with Greene, and by the end of the war, the entire eastern section of South Carolina was basically under Marion's control, and he helped restore civilian rule in a very meaningful way. Marion has always been Georgetown's favorite son, and between November of 1780 and May of 1781, Marion made 3 attempts to retake the city, the last attempt being the only one that was successful. So the question becomes why? I read one book said that he wanted to liberate Georgetown because it was his boyhood town. I read in another book it said that he wanted to get a nice new uniform because his uniform was kind of ratty looking after being in the woods for so long. I don't think so. Marion was a much more substantial person than that. I have, over the years, done a lot of research, and it's always fun to go to places. Went to Georgetown and looked around for evidence of Francis Marion. Didn't find much. Nice memorial to the fact he liberated the town. Went to the Information Bureau and asked them if they knew where Francis Marion lived when he lived in Georgetown or where his brother lived. And they were pointed out to me a place called Belle Isle, which is a golf course out in the islands. And they said, that's where he was born. There's a fireplace there left. Very pretty place, nice fireplace, nice ruins, but has absolutely nothing to do with Francis Marion. The Belle Isle in Georgetown was owned by the Horry family. Peter Horry lived there for a while, and he inherited it from, I think, his uncle. And as far as I know, the Marions never had any connection with it unless they visited there as a guest. So that was not correct. Francis Marion was born at a plantation called Goat's Field on the west branch of the Cooper River, in amongst the French settlements there. His parents moved from there to Georgetown around 1738-39, and all the books say that his parents went there to send him to school. But the problem is there was no school in Georgetown in 1739. there was not a school in Georgetown until 1755, at which time Marion was about 21, 22 years old, and well beyond going to school. So why did they move to Georgetown? Well, Lee gives us a hint in his memoirs when he says that the general's father became a little embarrassed in his affairs. And if you look, you will see that, in fact, around 1739, the elder Marion does become a little embarrassed in his affairs. He drops off the tax rolls. We start seeing family memorials indicating that the general's wife is in a necessary situation with finances, and her extended family is trying to help her financially. So we have a problem that the general's father is having a tough time financially. By moving to Georgetown, he does two things. He immerses his younger two sons, Francis and Job, in an English culture, in the English language, because they had been living in a French community. And also, the Marions are very heavily intermarrying with the Alston family, which is a very wealthy family in Georgetown. John Alston Jr., the son of a very prominent rice grower, marries the general's oldest sister, Esther. The general's brother, Benjamin, marries Martha Alston. The general has a first cousin, Esther Simmons, who marries Josiah Alston, and Isaac, the brothers of General Marion, marries Rebecca Alston, who is a cousin of the other Alstons. So we have this tremendous intermarriage of the Marion family and the first families of Georgetown. And it's possible that collectively they had a tutor, and that the general would have learned from a tutor. So in about 1750, the general's father dies, and John Alston, who is the husband of the general's oldest sister, Esther, leaves a will in which he says that Esther Marion, the general's mother, is entitled to live for her life in John Alston's townhouse in Georgetown, and that Esther Marion, John Alston's wife, the general's sister, it's tough, these names keep repeating each other. You know, I'm sorry if it gets kind of confusing. Everybody should name their kids different names, but they don't. Anyway, the sister is entitled to live there during her widowhood. Now you have to understand at this time period that women did not have the right to own property if they were married. Once you married, your husband owned everything you had, right down to the shoes on your feet. And he could do with it whatever he wanted. So frequently, male family members would leave things to women in trust, or the right to use during their life, or the right to use during their widowhood, because they didn't want the property to pass out of the family to the new husband where it could be dissipated. So Esther Marion was the mother, had the right to live there her life, and the Esther Marion, the general's sister, could live there during her widowhood. Now, about the same time, 1752, Gabriel Marion, the general's brother, also buys a townhouse in Georgetown, and they were all living there. And they lived there until about 1755, when the general, his mother, and Gabriel move up the river. Come back here. Whoops. They move up the Santee River, and they have a plantation up there. Okay. The brother Isaac Marion and Gabriel Marion and Benjamin Marion all become justices of the peace, so they're important people in the community. Isaac establishes himself at Little River, which is north of Georgetown. This is Little River, very pretty, right on the border of North and South Carolina. And if you ever on Route 17, stop and go into Little River, and you'll see this. But what you'll also find out is Isaac had a tavern there. Well, there's still a tavern there, and if you go there and you look and you say, this is a dive. I'm sorry. You gotta look at this and you gotta figure Isaac was a smuggler, because it's a perfect place for a smuggler. And indeed, Isaac Marion was apparently a member of the Committee of Correspondence, And when they sent the first notice of the Battle of Concord, Lexington, they went to Isaac, not to Georgetown where they were royal authorities, not to Charlestown where they were royal authorities, but to Little River where they could come and go without the authorities seeing them. It's a very beautiful spot, but it's immediately apparent when you go there that it was a great spot for smugglers. Isaac was very well thought of in his community. This is what they call a horse, all right? Isaac had a tough time during the American Revolution. The British, after they took Georgetown, took Little River. By December of 1780, they had Little River, and Isaac was back in Georgetown. And there's a story in Georgetown that the British, in an attempt to find General Marion, made Isaac Marion ride the horse backwards. It was a sorrel horse, like the general rode a red horse, and people have assumed that that is a flesh and blood animal. In fact, the British Army had a punishment they called riding the horse. And they'd make the person sit on this rather uncomfortable contraption, and it was a punishment. And in Isaac's case, it was a means basically of torture to try to get him to disclose where his brother was. And Isaac would say, "I don't know where he is, but you'll hear from him shortly." And in fact, the British did. Can we get dark down a little bit? When Georgetown was founded, I can apologize, this looked a lot darker on my computer. This is the plot plan for the town as it was laid out. If you look at Georgetown today, this is the map that they give you as a tourist to show you around. You can see there's really not much changed. And this is a map that George helped me make up. Although the Bureau in Georgetown couldn't tell me where anybody lived, I was able to figure it out. Gabriel Marion owned this lot here, which is lot 82. This is the lot he bought. He eventually sold it to his brother Job. Over here, next to him, was owned by Job's wife, who was owned by the Gilliards. They became Tories, but at this point in time, they were friends. The lot over here was the senior John Alston's lot. He gave half of it to his son, Josiah, whose wife, as I said before, was Esther Simmons, whose sister was Mary Esther Vidoe. So Mary Esther Vidoe had half of this that she would have visited with her parents. And the other half went to the general's mother, Esther Marion. So chances are General Marion lived right in this block here when he was in Georgetown. The other interesting spot is up here. This is where Isaac Marion had a right to live because Rebecca Alston, his wife, had the right to live in her father's townhouse. And this was the house they occupied. William Alston, her father, lived next door, was right here. All right, all of which is interesting. But then the other interesting thing is, during the occupation, this was the British headquarters. This was the commandant's house. This was the barracks that they had the British soldiers in. And this was the hospital. So that building there still exists. And it wasn't until I walked the streets of Georgetown that I realized poor Isaac Marion was living between the hospital, where the British were bringing back their wounded, and the barracks where the British were being housed. So there's no wonder when the British came back from trying to chase Francis Marion and not catching him, as they're coming back to town, they break into Isaac's house and totally trash it. So Isaac, they say in real estate, location, location, location. Well, Isaac had a horrible location, location, and he suffered for it. So why 3 times did General Marion try to take Georgetown? We look a little bit closer at Georgetown. Georgetown sits down here at the bottom of this tremendous river system going all the way up into North Carolina. And down that river system came turpentine, came pitch, came tar, all needed for the Royal Navy, came lumber needed by the Royal Navy. In this area we have rice that was needed for food for the Army and the Navy. We have a draining of the basin where the people from Middlesbrough could bring their beef down salted for provisions. A lot of strategic material coming down here. There were salt boilers in Georgetown. Salt was very necessary. In a hot climate, you need the salt to replace the electrolytes that you perspire out in hot weather. In this time period, you needed salt to preserve meat. So salt was a critical element. All of this was in Georgetown. So if Marion could seize Georgetown, he could deprive the British of all those things. And he would have them for the use of the American Army. Furthermore, up in this area, there's a big concentration of Tories, and by controlling Georgetown, he could control the supplies going to those Tories, because the only other way they could get supplies would be out of Wilmington. If you look at the map as it was at that time, you had Savannah, you had Charlestown, you had Georgetown, you had Wilmington, but the next real port wasn't until you got to Norfolk, Virginia. So Georgetown was much more important as a port of entry back then than it is now. The other way of getting supplies up and down the coast was what they call a Great Wagon Road that ran all the way up to Philadelphia, but it goes through Camden. And if you're General Cornwallis and you want to invade North Carolina, you're going up this wagon road. That's where they were fighting. And he could get supplies one of two ways. He could get them from Charlestown or he could get them from Georgetown. And as you notice, Georgetown's shorter. To get them from Charlestown, he would float them up the Cooper River to the area of Monk's Corner. They would then have to unload the supplies, put them on wagons, take them across Monk's Corner up to Nelson's Ferry, put them on the old Cherokee Path and run them up the old River Road on the north side of the river, because the road on the south side of the river wasn't worth calling a road. It was only a footpath. They couldn't get a wagon up there conveniently. That's why that whole area became very strategic. If you look at South Carolina map, I've highlighted the rivers. This is the Santee River. The other rivers coming out of Georgetown, I've got ahead of my notes, it's always a danger. You have the Sandpit, the Black, the Mingo, the Waccamaw, if I pronounced that right, the Great PD, and the Little PD. In order to get into this area of South Carolina, there's only 4 or 5 fords. There's a Lynch's Causeway, there's Murray's Ferry, there's Lanute's Ferry, I've done that in the wrong order, there's Nelson's Ferry and McCourt's Ferry. And these are choke points. If you can't get across those areas, you can't get from this part of South Carolina to that part of South Carolina. And Marion is sitting in this area, he's controlling this. And the only other way of getting up in this area is to come behind through Georgetown. And if he controls Georgetown, he controls this whole area by also controlling those ferries. So it makes it strategic. Greene never really appreciated that. From Greene's point of view, Georgetown was a minor interest, but Marion saw it as a very important interest. Today we talk in military terms about logistics. They say that amateurs in the military talk about, military buffs talk about strategy. Professional soldiers talk about logistics. Marion was trained by the British as a provincial officer in the Indian Wars. He was one of those core Americans that really had some professional training. He thought in terms of logistics. If you control the supplies, you control the territory. Today we would talk in terms of a railhead or in terms of an airport. Georgetown was the equivalent of a World War II railhead. It was the equivalent today of an airport. And for Marion, it was something he wanted very, very much. He could disrupt the Tories by holding it. He could get supplies in from out of the country by holding it. And he saw it as very important. So the first time he attacked it, it was in November of 1780. It was not a very determined attack on his part. He sent probing forces out. This is just another map showing the roads. It's in the back, it's a little bit clearer. This is a map showing that great road again. And if you look closely, this is a map showing the movements of the armies, which is really this movement here down that road. This is where they were fighting. The first time Marion attacked Georgetown, he did so with a number of probing incidences where he sent his men out to patrols and they cut off the town. They tried to raid it. Ended in disaster personally for Marion because his nephew was captured and murdered during that raid. William Dobbin James, who was one of Marion's men and a biographer, records the incident. James was terribly impressed because they killed the schoolmaster at the same time. For a young man, 16 years old, the fact they killed the schoolmaster was something he couldn't understand. But when they captured the younger Marion, Gabriel, and the schoolmaster, they beat them savagely with rifles. And then when the younger Marion was recognized as being a Marion, they put a gun up to his chest and just killed him. And the other thing that James recounts, and he's the only first person who does that, Marion cried. And that a man that was known for being very unemotional about everything, the fact that he cried was something that, and he wasn't ashamed to do so. He was a man in a man's world, and he showed his emotion at that time. But after a bit, he got over it, and he said that his nephew was a virtuous young man. He died in the cause of liberty, and he would grieve no more. And so they went on. Shortly after that, Harry Lee arrives in Marion's camp. This is in January, and they plan to attack Georgetown. It's a complicated plan. Marion has determined that Georgetown really is not defended very well from the sea, and he sends his infantry down the river network. They hide out in the marsh near Georgetown. The plan is they're going to come in at night, and they're going to attack the town at night from two sides. The cavalry will come overland. They'll come down the highway. The two groups will meet at night, and they will take the town. So the first group goes down the river. They spend the day hiding out in the marsh. It's nighttime, it's around midnight, everything's quiet, the crickets are doing their crickety things. I don't know whether the moon was out, but everything's quiet, people are asleep. The British officers had been partying right here at the hotel, at the inn. They'd had a good time that night, and they were all sleeping in the inn, and everything was quiet in town. And Bree and his men are creeping up from the water end of the town. They creep up and they get the British headquarters, which is here, and they're creeping up into town. And what they're supposed to do is to get between the British barracks, which is here, and what I believe is the fort, which is up here, I believe, and prevent the British soldiers from running into the fort. But the cavalry hasn't arrived yet. And they're afraid if they wait any longer, they'll be discovered. So they're creeping through the town, and they come up and they catch the British commander in bed, wake him up and say, "You're our prisoner." And that all works out well. And not for the British commander, but you know, for our guys. And they've been informed that the rest of the officers are here at this building here that is the inn. And they burst into the inn, and this fighting begins, and the British soldiers, the officers that are asleep in the inn, hear the commotion. They come running out on the porches. They don't bother to get dressed. There's this fight on the porch. And let me read what Peter Orry says about it, because I think it can't be put in any better words. He writes, "The infantry and cavalry employed on the occasion were to approach the town at different points, after midnight, and at a signal from the latter to commence the attack. Unfortunately, the cavalry did not get up in town, and owing to some fault of their guide. The infantry arrived at the appointed moment, and dreading the dangers of delay, charged at once into the town, which they found totally unprepared for the attack. Colonel Campbell, the commander, was made prisoner in his bed. Adjutant Crookshanks, Major Irwin, and the other officers were sound asleep at a tavern belonging to a genteel family with whom they had spent the evening with great hilarity. A detachment of our men approached the house and surrounded it. Soon the alarm was given. The officers leaped out of bed and, not waiting to dress, flew into the piazza, flourishing their pistols and shouting to the charge. Major Irwin, with more courage than discretion, fired a pistol and would have tried another, but just as he had it cocked, he was stopped short by the stroke of a bayonet, which ended him and his courage together. Adjutant Cruikshanks, acting in the same heroic style, would have shared the same fate had it not been for an angel of a young woman, daughter of the gentleman of the house. This charming girl was engaged to be married to Cruikshanks. Waked by the firing and horrible din of battle on the piazza, she was at first almost reft of her senses by the fright. But the moment she heard her lover's voice, all her terrors vanished, and instead of hiding herself under the bedclothes, she rushed into the piazza amidst the mortal foray, and with no armor but her love, and no covering but her flowing tresses, happily for her lover, she got to him just in time to throw her arms around his neck and scream out, "Oh, save, save Major Cruikshanks!" Thus with her own sweet body shielding him against the uplifted swords of her enraged countrymen. Cruikshanks yielded himself our prisoner, but we paroled him immediately on the spot and left him to those delicious sentiments which he must have felt in the arms of an elegant young woman who had saved his life. The eyes of all, even the poorest soldiers in our camp, sparkled with pleasure whenever they talked, as often they did, of this charming woman and of our generosity to Major Cruikshanks. And to this day, even after the lapse of 30 years, I never think of it, but with pleasure, a pleasure as exquisite perhaps as what I felt at the moment of the first transaction. So here we have this, in the middle of the battle, this apparition of a beautiful woman just covered with her tresses, not her dresses, appearing, and the soldiers stopping mid-battle to enjoy the affair. In any event, instead of the soldiers rushing to the enlisted soldiers, because they captured almost all the officers, instead of the enlisted soldiers rushing forward to the fort, they barricaded themselves in their barracks. And this is what they were using for the barracks. It was the church, St. George, which is a brick structure. The NCOs were apparently smarter than the officers. They barricaded themselves in there, and Marion decided that without a cannon, it would be too costly to try to take the church by force, and so he and Lee withdrew with their prisoners. It scared the bejeebers out of the British, needless to say. The third time Marion approached Georgetown was after he'd taken Fort Mott and Fort Watson, and he showed up in front of the city, and he started doing what they call regular trenching. He started digging trenches to approach the town, to take it by siege. Now, he had just come back being successful against Fort Mott and Fort Watson. In fact, what Marion wanted, for the most part, Marion got, and they weren't going to risk that. And in the middle of the night, the British evacuated the town. They had earlier orders saying, we can't defend you out there in Georgetown, so if there's any serious demonstrations against you, you have the authority to leave the town, which they did. Marion occupied the town, and 2 days later, his brother, Isaac, who was his last surviving brother, passed away and was buried in this area of the churchyard at St. George. I have to imagine that Isaac probably had not been well for some time, and I would also have to imagine there was a certain amount of fear on the part of the British not wanting to get captured by Marion, knowing that his brother had been abused by them and his brother was dying. Once Georgetown was taken, the British were in a bad situation. Greene had tried to force a retreat, to force the British out of Camden, was not able to do so. Tried to force the British out of 96, was not able to do so. But again, logistics is the key to these things. Once Fort Watson and Fort Mott were taken up, it's Fort Watson, is it Fort Mott up there, I think? Camden couldn't get supplied. They had to withdraw. Once Orangeburg was taken, and Fort Granby, which I think is in this area, again, no, Fort Granby. You know, you come to a point in life you can't see at any distance, it's very annoying. In the event, when those two forts were taken, they could not support 96 anymore. They could not supply it. And the British withdrew, and withdrew back to Charlestown, as we heard last night from Chris Swager. The last push of them out of the interior was with the battle at Utah Springs, which sealed their fate. Almost as soon as Marion took Georgetown, supplies started to flow. And Georgetown eventually became this huge depot of supplies for the American Army. Privateers on the American side started using Georgetown as a base to raid British commerce. Commerce was opened with the Indian islands, the Caribbean islands, the West Indies, and goods and supplies started to come from there. Marion was in essence levying a tax on the Tories and on the Whigs of the area by asking for a proportion of their produce. It was being traded. He also, I believe, was involved in a black market trade with Charleston itself to get military supplies for the troops. We see him instituting price controls in Georgetown and basically regulating, with Peter Ory in charge, a total economic life of Georgetown. Because Marion did not believe Georgetown could be held from a determined attack, he moved those supplies up to Willtown on the Black River, and they established a huge depot at Willtown for supplies. And when Greene, now realizing the importance of Georgetown, became obsessed with, you've got to protect Georgetown, he sent engineers there to fortify it. He would write to Marion periodically, the British are going to attack Georgetown. And Marion's response was, we'll pull everything up to Willtown, which we can defend, that you cannot defend Georgetown from the type of attack, basically, that he had waged against it. After Marion had captured Georgetown, after he was basically pacified much of this area, he was able to force a treaty on the Tories that had been supplied through Georgetown up in what's today the area of the town of Marion. To much to Thomas Sumter's shame, I believe, Sumter authorized a raid into the Georgetown area while it was controlled by Marion for the sole purpose of looting. Marion complained very bitterly to the governor at the time, and there was an order to stop confiscating Tory property, slaves and such, because of that. It caused some problems. Georgetown was shelled once by a British warship, and much of the town burned. But the constant flow of supplies into the American interior for the American Army continued, and Georgetown remained a key community until Charlestown was evacuated, and the American Army then controlled the entire area. So I think that pretty much concludes my talk. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
No questions? Go ahead and take a 15-minute break.